Good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon I was asked to come along and talk really about how publishers are getting ROI from the power of content online. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. But content in the sense that content driving revenues from the content itself, but also how content is driving the commercial value that publishers are deriving as well. So that's kind of the pitch and where I'm coming from with that. Oh. So I just wanted to set the scene really and explain a little about who I am, who we are. So AOP is the Association of Online Publishers. It's our role to work with publishers who create original content and help them to develop their online businesses. So you can see from the slide there the kind of media owners that we're talking about, and it's going to be some stats from a piece of work that we've done with this group of publishers that is going to kind of inform a lot of the conversation this afternoon. So what you can see is we're talking here about many traditional media companies, those who retain an editorial team and create their own content. And from the scale of those media owners, as you can see, they represent quite a large footprint across the online publishing marketplace. So there are really kind of three strands that I want to try and cover off today. What I want to try to do is illustrate that the role that content has in driving commercial revenues for online businesses, how content itself is actually the driver or using content as a driver of creativity to unlock commercial value, and then also to look at kind of what the role of audience data is right now, which is becoming increasingly important in terms of unlocking value for content development, but also for commercial and advertising opportunities. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is a little bit of a look back at 2013 and what happened there. So every month we at AOP are working alongside Deloitte, capture revenues from online publishers to look at what the state of the market actually is. That's a study that's based on 25 major publishing companies. You've seen the slide a moment ago. It's most of those brands. They share with us in a very black box environment what their revenues look like. And from that, we're able to get a pretty good barometer of what's happening in the market. And so from a content publisher point of view, last year, from a commercial revenue point of view, wasn't bad. 18% growth year on year in terms of advertising. Just to put that into perspective, if you look at the last 5 years that this study's been running for, you'll see that that's actually the highest rate of growth for any year in that period. So when we started back in 2009, clearly, you know, the crash of 2008, the pain was felt. The following year, you can see the decline in revenue of 9%. Clearly, that didn't take too long to bounce back, and it's ticked up ever since. But in terms of the best rate of growth, then 2013 clearly, with 18%, is the best rate of growth over the last 6 years. So that kind of suggests that there's a lot of value being found from an advertising point of view in an environment that is a content environment. And in fact, the actual growth in revenues, commercial revenues, over that 5-year period is around 85%. So pretty significant growth. To try and put that into some context, so the view here from the Advertising Association and WARC figures for the first half of 2013, the full figures for the full year aren't out yet. But you can see different media and what rate of growth they were achieving in the first part of 2013. And you can see that online media grew by 16%. And the only other media that showed any growth were TV, which went up by 2%, and outdoor, which went up very fractionally. So clearly you can see that online is the engine room for media growth. And so a growth of 18% in the content environment is actually good, slightly ahead of the overall curve. And if we wanted to look at a couple of other comparisons, eMarketer, for instance, are suggesting that digital growth last year was somewhere around about 15.8%, and Group M are suggesting it's probably around 17%. So, you know, it's kind of in line with that. It's actually slightly ahead, which is positive. Now, if you dig down into that 18% growth, obviously there are different elements that are contributing to that. And it's probably no surprise to see the scale of growth in mobile, and we'll talk a bit about mobile and the issue around multi-device publishing shortly. But you can see that mobile-specific advertising growth touched 80% in 2013. Display advertising, your traditional display formats, the growth isn't bad. It's around about 16%. But I think what we're seeing here is actually elements, it's around 20%, but you can see elements like sponsorship showing a 16% growth there, and that's going to be quite interesting for us to focus on shortly too. Video advertising, like mobile, there's a growing demand from an audience to be entertained, to be engaged, to interact with content in a different way, and so formats like video, formats like mobile particularly, are going to become increasingly important. So 2013 looked like being quite a positive year overall. I mean, it wasn't for everybody. So out of that 18% growth, it's not 18% across the board. And in fact, about a quarter of the businesses that we surveyed didn't achieve growth last year. So let's not assume that it's complete roses everywhere we look. But actually, there's quite a lot of optimism for what this year might provide. So if you look at the IPA Bellwether report, for instance, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's a study that's carried out amongst a number of marketeers on a quarterly basis by the IPA. And what they're looking for there is a sentiment that tells whether or not people believe there's more confidence in the industry going forward, and whether or not they're adjusting their marketing budgets up or down accordingly. So what we see here is the difference between the numbers who are increasing their marketing budgets versus the numbers who are decreasing their marketing budgets. So you can see that that's a net growth of 11% at the back end of 2013, so thinking about 2014. That's actually the 5th successive quarter of growth, which is the second highest sequence that's been seen since this study started quite a few years ago now. But again, you can see that the adjustment is towards online, so there's a 9% uplift in online budgets. So, what we're seeing here is a real polarization of interest around marketing activity and ad spend towards the online environment, and then obviously what I want to talk about is towards the content element of the online environment. And that optimism is kind of shared by premium content creators as well, because in the survey that we ran at the back end of last year, you can see an uplift in Q4 to almost half of the publishers who actually believe that the prospects are going to get better over the coming period, compared to those who felt that was the case only in Q3 last year. And in terms of the rate of growth, we've got a 50% split. So 50% are expecting to get growth up to 10% in 2014, but another 50% are expecting to get growth of 11 to 20%. So really quite a bullish outlook. And actually, I think it's fair to say that it might be a bullish outlook, but actually people are generally quite conservative. They don't want to get beaten up, so they tend to go cautiously. So if the belief is that it's around 50% at 11 to 20, I think you could probably safely say it's going to be a bit higher than that. So taking a bit of a longer term view, and just want to concentrate on the importance of digital, you can see here that the digital growth going forward, in percentage terms, it's going to slow down, because it has to, because of the size of money being spent now on that medium. It can't sustain the growth rates that it's had, but it's still going to be the premium driver of growth. And within the digital spend, you can see that actually the main driver of growth is going to come from mobile activity. So mobile advertising reached over £1 billion in the UK last year, so it's really on that upward curve. This year it's predicted now to probably get to somewhere like £2.25 billion, which is really, really quite significant. And in fact, an Ofcom study actually suggested that if you look worldwide, the highest rate of spend on mobile advertising per head is actually in the UK. So £8 per head is being spent. So £8 per head of mobile audience is being spent on advertising, which is the highest in the world. So clearly, there's a lot of belief in a headroom of growth. Now, to put that into some context, if you look ahead a couple of years, you get to 2016, that's when we see a real tipping point, because that's when the digital spend is going to be as much as every other media type added together. So 2016, if those predictions continue, digital spend will be over 50% of all advertising spend. And that's £8.5 billion in the UK out of a total of about 16 billion. And you can see the percentage contribution from mobile creeping up to 19% is going to make it almost on a par with TV. So right here, right now, it looks like there's a huge gap. Actually, in 2 or 3 years' time, it could be that mobile is attracting as much spend as TV. Okay, so what about the actual environment of quality content? And how are we driving ROI out of that kind of environment? So firstly, interesting stat from a census that we conducted at the back end of last year. Almost 2/3 of publishers are now charging for content. Now, that doesn't mean to say everything is being charged for. Clearly, some publishers are putting up a paywall. So, we've seen The Sun and The Telegraph both move to pay models in 2013. Sometimes it's a complete pay model. Other times it's a kind of pick and mix type effect. Having said that, the free model, totally free access model, is now going to be the prominent model for only 1 in 3 publishers. So that's really quite an interesting change. That's suggesting that there is value in content per se, and that publishers are finding ways to monetize that content. There is a lot of experimentation going on. The freemium model, obviously a model where some content is free to consume, and then there are barriers, payment barriers to consume additional content, is the fastest growing model that we're seeing now applied across content websites. So about 1 in 4 publishers are applying that model. The study that I showed you the results from a moment ago were all based on advertising revenues, but it's also worth noting that subscription revenues or content revenues, so this might be a one-off purchase, it might be an annual subscription, those subscription revenues have grown by 40% year on year, which is really quite significant. Now, a lot of that might come from the B2B marketplace, where it's a more established practice. It might come from an increase in actual subscription costs, but it's definitely also coming from things like apps and digital editions, which are being introduced at a growing rate. And in fact, the revenue from subscriptions or paid content amongst this group of publishers has increased by 150% since we started looking at those numbers back 5 years ago. And the belief amongst publishers is that the platform that's going to offer the greatest opportunity is likely to be tablet. As we all know, growing consumption on tablet of both reading and buying behavior seem to offer a better opportunity to provide content in a format people want to buy, people want to pay for, slightly ahead of desktop and actually ahead of smartphone apps. So the device is going to be a big driver of those content revenues and their growth in the future. So, it's going to be it is a multi-device challenge now. There's no getting away from it, and the proliferation of devices is only going to get bigger. But if you look at how people are using devices to access online at the present time, it's interesting that 1 in 4 page views we're seeing are coming from a non-PC device. So either a smartphone or a tablet or something like a games console, and that number's only going to increase. So last year there were 20 million tablet users in the UK. By this year it's expected to rise to nearly 25 million. That's almost 50% of the population, so very, very significant. Expected to grow to 35 million by 2017. Here's an interesting stat. 4 out of every 5 people reach for their smartphones within 15 minutes of waking every morning. So I don't know whether you're one of those people or whether you're the 1 in 5 who doesn't do that, but it suggests that the majority do. 30% of the new mobile contracts that are being bought on a daily basis are on 4G. So that's clearly going to suggest that your ability to consume content, particularly things like video content, is going to grow. And the question is, are you mobile optimized? So, if you're not mobile optimized, you're going to miss out on a massive amount of audience with this proliferation of devices, with this style of consumption. And it's quite interesting that I think the latest stat is that 75% of retailers are now mobile optimized, which is kind of good, because if you look back about a year ago, it was probably only about 50%. But it makes you wonder why it's not 100%, because if people are increasingly using mobile devices, and in fact we know that something like 12% of people want to make purchases by mobile as opposed to desktop, then you need to be mobile optimized. At the same time, as a publisher, you need to be mobile optimized to take advantage of the changing consumer behavior. And I think as it stands, only something like about 2/3 of publishers have got the majority of their portfolios actually mobile optimized and ready. So you can see the intention here from publishers in terms of priorities for content delivery are pretty much led by mobile. Desktop obviously is still important, it's not going to go away, but tablets, again, are going to feature very, very heavily in the strategy. So I guess the issue here is that increasingly it's going to be necessary to deliver content synchronously across devices. And by dint of that, you know, a responsive design focus is going to be the de facto basis of development of websites. So that's going to drive a publisher's ability to operate effectively going forward. But as evidence that a multi-platform consumption is strengthening the bonds with content, and I guess then strengthening the opportunities for ROI too. So if you look at a piece of work that News UK carried out, and they were looking at measuring their users and their readers who consume news in print, but also news through digital editions. So effectively what you've got is a multiplication effect of the exposure. And you can see here a number of metrics that in that study showed fairly significant gains. So things like exposure across print and across digital editions increased the degree of influence. It increased things like the reputation of the brand. When we're talking about exposure to advertising that people have seen in these two different platforms, it increases the desire to buy, the affinity, it increases the appeal. So clearly there is a great opportunity, and I think you know, we've probably all seen those curved diagrams that show how people consume across different devices through the day. You know, whether it is that smartphone as you get out of bed in the morning, on the commute in, moves onto a desktop in the evening, moves onto a tablet. We've seen that kind of curve. And actually what we're seeing here is that reinforces the more exposure across those devices. If that content is served seamlessly, that it reinforces that bond between the user, the consumer, and the media brand. And so that content has a massive impact in terms of loyalty from an audience, but also from an opportunity market from an advertising perspective. But the thing around mobile and mobile content, mobile environments in terms of maximizing revenue opportunity is it's about creativity. So clearly, mobile screen doesn't look like a desktop screen. It's a lot smaller. There's so much that you can do with it or not do with it. A lot of advertising tends to be banners. It tends to be very small. A lot of the access to that advertising can often be a mistake. Clicking on it you didn't mean to. So, you know, here's some examples of rich media formats where an expandable banner is the actual ad format. So click on the banner, it expands, and in that banner you've got things like video, you've got calls to action, you've got various different types of content. And we conducted a study looking at the effectiveness of that kind of format of advertising in a premium content environment. And what we saw there was very much higher stats in terms of trust, in terms of relevance for that environment, but also in terms of people's intent to engage, not just engage with the content, but to actually then consider purchase, consider recommending those brands. So I think there's a whole challenge about the way in which commercialization around content, but on a mobile site, happens, and we'll talk about that again shortly. And so there's a real gap presently in terms of ROI between traffic and between monetization. So it's a bit of a lag. So 20%, or what percentage of publishers get at least 20% of their traffic from a different device and at least 20% of their revenue from that device? So clearly this is a survey that was done at the back end of 2013. A big movement in mobile, so almost half of publishers getting at least 20% of their traffic from a smartphone device, but correspondingly only 3% getting 20% of their revenue. So that traffic's coming in, it's not being monetized. The ROI on it isn't that great as it stands. On tablet, it's actually a little bit better. So 16% are getting 20% of traffic coming via a tablet device, and 6% are monetizing that. And I think that's mainly down to the fact that that monetization on tablet is often by digital edition, an app for a content-based purchase, as opposed to an advertising purchase. So content as a creative, what do we mean by that? Well, clearly there's been an awful lot of mileage around the growth of branded content and native advertising. So content as an environment offers a great opportunity for consumers to interact. So from a native advertising point of view, it's a very cost-effective way to get a message across in a deeper context. And it's being embraced by more and more publishers. And the real key to this is it being done sympathetically, if you like? Is it being done in tandem with the brand values? There's a very interesting article that was in the Guardian US today, actually, or it might have been yesterday, and it talked about journalism selling its soul. So, is journalism selling its soul? So, everyone kind of realizes the value of content, the value of that relationship that you can create with a user through content. So, if you start to turn that content over to advertisers to use commercially, either with native formats that appear in the content as opposed to, you know, on a website at the side of the page or at the top of the page, or actually if you actually run, you know, content, but it's from an advertiser, is that selling your soul? Or actually, if it's reflecting the brand values of the media brand, is that an extension of a value that you're actually offering? So there's a real fine line around this. So I was going to show you a couple of examples, but the web links aren't working, so I can't really do that. But here's an example from The Guardian, and this is Everything Everywhere, and they've kind of introduced some sponsored content. But it's that introduction of sponsored content that spawned all that other content around it, which isn't from those guys. And what that content, or what that sponsorship, if you like, has enabled is to deliver content that audience might like and see fit as part of The Guardian anyway. But it's actually enabled a lot more content to be brought to the reader. And in a similar vein, another example is Outbrain, who have created this content partnership with the Guardian as well. And the Guardian are very well geared up to do this because they've got a whole team of people who are looking at kind of extracting greater value out of commercial content arrangements. I mean, they've got 133 people, so they've probably got more people than a lot of media owners have got in total, just focused on this particular area. But it's a kind of interesting debate. So we conducted a study last year looking at how content partnerships work. And when we talk about content partnerships, we are talking about a real partnership where the media brand is producing the content. So this is different from an advertiser, an agency supplying some content, dropping it in amongst the existing content on any media brand and saying, there's the fit. Clearly, that might not fit. It might not represent the brand values. So this is about content that the media brand creates. It has that association then of quality as a result of that. And it builds on the trust that media brand has established with its audience. A content partnership allows a commercial brand to get across a deeper level of information, because it's editorial. It's not just a quick message, it's not a display ad, it's not a banner, it's actually quite a deep read, or it can be a deep read. And that deeper level of engagement should deliver a stronger story. So the outcome of that is that association with premium content can do two things. It can either strengthen an existing brand's values, or it can help to reposition a brand, because you're using the medium of the established brand that you're working within, and you're tapping into the psyche of that audience and making a connection through an editorial piece. But it's actually a content piece. So here are some examples of the case studies that we looked at when we were trying to measure what impact that has and how it works. And these were case studies that ran in print, and they also ran online. And as you can see, they are very typical of content output for a media brand. So, you know, some of those media brands were brands like The Guardian did take part, The Telegraph took part, What Hi-Fi, Stuff, Marie Claire took part, a number of well-established brands. And we're reflecting here content, or commercial content, that is actually multifaceted. So, you know, it contains photography, it contains video, it contains maybe links online to download. It might have an interactive element, call up certain features like maps, for instance, that you can interact with. But as you can see, it doesn't look like an ad. It's very much an editorial piece. And it's kind of produced very sympathetically, if you like, to reflect the values that the media brand would have. And there are some more examples, more from the print side with the What Hi-Fi and Stuff ones. So what we found with that piece of work was that those kind of partnerships do strengthen an implicit association with the core brand values, and they do help to reposition brand values. So what we mean by that is, whilst we can try to measure the way in which people consume that kind of content, does it make them want to buy the brand more? Does it make them want to recommend the brand more? Yes is the answer, it does, generally, because it helps to raise those perceptions. But what brand advertising's really trying to do is instill a mindset in the consumer that either recognises what that brand stands for and makes it come through more strongly, or changes what people think about that brand and repositions it. And there's kind of two axes to this. One is an implicit axis, which is how quickly do people make that connection, and the other one is an explicit, which is how strongly do they believe that is actually the case. And what you're really looking for is an optimum movement on both of those axes, so that people will change their opinion or strengthen their opinion, and that they'll do it more quickly, because then they're more focused on having that brand at top of mind. And what we found in the study that we did, using a technique called implicit response technique, was that in every case, we were able to show a fairly significant uplift on those brand emotional measurement aspects, and that was actually increased when the person consuming that content had consumed it both in print and online. So if you remember, like the News UK study, that multiplier effect, when someone has actually connected with content on more than one platform, definitely has an impact, definitely changes association. So from a commercial point of view, content partnerships are actually very valuable. They might be more difficult to execute and they might cost more money, but you know, they definitely have a value. And you know, let's be honest, nearly everyone is doing it now. If we talk about content marketing, so here are some stats that look at what the spend on content marketing is likely to do in the coming 12 months. And as you can see, not many people are going to decrease their spend. And about 7% are unsure. So 90% are going to be at least staying the same, if not increasing their spend on content marketing. So it's going to happen more and more. The contention would be just creating a piece of content, particularly as a brand, isn't sufficient. You've got to get it in front of an audience in the right context. So the point is that you might create that, how are you going to draw people to it? How also are you going to, if you're going to go through a social media route, is that going to be enough? Is that going to be enough to connect? I think what we're saying is that actually, you need to put it into the right context. And the right context is to be surrounded by content that is of a high value. So here's a quote from the publisher of the New York Times, who talks about the approach and how they will deal with it. And it said, "It's the sort of content that can live at the heart rather than the periphery of the publication." So in other words, we're not going to put any old junk in there. It's going to have to reflect what our readers are used to seeing, the kind of style, the tone, the aesthetic. It's got to fit. It's what our readers would expect to see. But is there a blurred line? So another part of that statement talked about not pulling the wool over people's eyes, but making it clear that people would recognise that it was actually commercial content. And therein lies the dilemma, and whether journalism is selling its soul. So putting something like a blue border around that content could be perceived to be distinguishing it. You can be your own judges of whether that does distinguish it or whether it doesn't. In the US, the IAB are looking at it to try to come up with some regulatory guidelines. So do you mark it, do you stamp it, commercial content? Do you do that in a very fine way, or do you just blatantly ignore it and let the user decide for themselves what it is? And so that is the challenge that media owners must face. How do you want to flag it? How do you want your audience to perceive it? I think you could take the view that audiences are no fools, and audiences can detect whether content is actually written without a commercial bias or not. But, as the New York Times quote says, if it's informative, if it fits, if it has the right brand values, why doesn't it have a role? Is it part of the content proposition? And arguably, is that the future for mobile advertising? So here's an interesting quote. If you can provide contextually relevant and personally relevant advertising, you get a 40 or 50% lift in user engagement. So you saw the expected growth. In fact, you saw the actual growth in mobile ad spend last year, and you've seen that trajectory for where mobile ads are going to go. But they're not going to get there from just being banner ads and playing around with the furniture. And let's be honest, on a mobile screen, there's not a lot of furniture to play around with, because it's not really going to translate very effectively if you're looking at it on a pure mobile optimized site. So what we're seeing here is a move towards stream ads, in-stream ads. Yahoo, the company who probably started banner advertising off, are talking about scrapping banner advertising on mobile. It's too small, it's too ineffective. What's more effective, especially if you have a mobile optimized site and content appears in one stream and you're scrolling down that stream, is that it appears in that stream. And I think as that kind of vertical reading experience becomes more the norm, then arguably a native format, whether that's an ad dropped into the content or whether that's content in the content, is going to be the way to drive traction. If you look at Twitter, you see that more and more. If you look at Facebook, you can't get away from it. If you look at which company's lifted its mobile ad spend more than any other company in the world in the last 12 months, it's Facebook. It's gone from a non-mobile advertising business to a business that has more than 50% of its not insignificant revenue from mobile advertising, and that's how it's done it. So, there's a future. So my last section is going to be to talk about probably the most overworked word in media, which is data. Data, massively important to being able to develop your brand, your content, but also your commercial propositions. The example I like to use here as a good example is the one about Channel 4 and 4OD. So in 2012, Channel 4 set out to capture more user data and have gone in about an 18-month period or so from very little to more than 10 million registered users, which is pretty big. What's even bigger is that 50% of all 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK, Channel 4 have now got registration data on, which is great because that's the target audience of 4OD. And the whole purpose of having that data is to enable them to serve more effective content and more effective advertising to an audience that they know a lot about. So that first-party data is helping with ad innovation. It's also helping with content innovation. And understanding those user desires and journeys is helping them to make a real good commercial case where they can deliver something that the audience actually wants. And that's the value exchange. So those people who've signed up and given 4OD their details have done that because they know that what they're going to get served back is going to be more relevant to them. So that's a great example. And when we talk about first-party data, we're talking about all this kind of stuff. So if you've got a registration on your site, you can capture a lot of details about your audience and their behaviour and what they do. And that data is essential then, if it's brought together in the right way, to be able to help to deliver that content proposition and develop it, and also exploit the commercial opportunities. So, whoa, is that right? Yeah. So, from a commercial point of view, data is the future, or becoming the future of ad trading. Because the more that you can sell a targeted, personalized user, the more effective you're going to be able to attract commercial revenue growth. And what we're seeing is that a marketer is going to value first-party data highly because it tells them about that user and they can target that. If that marketer has that data and you haven't got that data, then you're at a disadvantage because they don't necessarily need you because they can target those people in other places. So what we're seeing is more and more publishers starting to work with a supply-side platform, which is helping them to bring that data together, helping them to value their audience, and as a result take part in real-time bidding. Programmatic trading, driven by agencies trying to get more efficient, trying to get more value, and push more inventory that way, suggests that maybe over half of display advertising will be sold programmatically by 2017. So it's in the publisher's interest to work with a supply-side platform, make sure their data is in the right shape to take part in that chase for revenue. Similarly, data management platforms coming to the fore. We've seen all of that first-party data on the last slide. Often it's captured in different ways. It really needs to be brought together. Having a data marketing platform means that you can build very neat targeted audience propositions that have got higher value that you can sell based around what activity they've done on your site that you know about. But it also means that a lot of publishers are moving off into audience extension, where they've got that data about that audience. They might not have all the inventory on their site that they can use to drive value. They can track that audience off-site and sell to an advertiser that audience on other third-party sites and extend their reach. We're also going to see more private marketplace activity. So publishers taking control of their inventory, putting it into a private marketplace, only accepting access to that from certain buying points based on the data that they've got about the value of that audience, where they can control the pricing. And what we're going to see is something like, at the moment, about one in five publishers are actively doing that. That's going to go up to at least 1 in 3 publishers. And on the supply side platforms, it's now about 2/3 of publishers who are working that way. So is that a big opportunity, though, from a content publisher's point of view to trade programmatically? Well, you can see the jury's out. When we did the survey last year, it was pretty much split between either it's a major opportunity or it's actually a small part of the business. But what we do know is you can't afford to ignore it. And so as a result, we're seeing much more dabbling in areas like real-time bidding, in areas like private marketplaces, and exposing first-party data. And as long as agencies continue to drive that as the mechanism for commercial sales, a publisher can't afford not to be there. I seem to have reached an impasse, which might be a good point because I think towards the end. Oh, there we go. So there we see some examples of how the ROI from content-based environment, both through content sales and development and also from advertising revenues, is happening. What the impact of multiple device consumption is, what the impact of data is likely to be going forward. I'm not going to dwell on this one. It's my last slide, just to say, it's not without issues and challenges. We'll leave those for another time. Multi-device measurement. How do you actually measure the audience that you're reaching across devices? How do you know it's not the same person consuming across 3 different devices during the day? Well, there are ways out there to try and determine that, but as things move on, that's going to get even more difficult. Imagine when wearables like the Google Glasses or watches start to become more the norm. Then it's just going to add more complexity to that, and that's going to be a challenge to be able to show your audience value across a number of devices. Ad fraud. I had a really interesting presentation this morning that talked about ad fraud, and people who are making a fortune out of using bots to effectively click on ads and create false impressions, false click-throughs that create a lot of money for the person who's setting that up and destroy the value for the advertiser. Interestingly, out of all the impressions served, a study from Integral Ad Science suggests that 15% of all the impressions served are false impressions, fraudulent impressions. However, only 2% of the fraudulent impressions are on publisher content-based websites, because publishers are pretty good at keeping their house in order and running a very good proposition. Where it does happen is at the long tail of the internet, where there are less scrupulous, less content-led sites, and 25% of all the impressions going through exchanges and 20% of all the impressions going through networks are considered to be fraudulent impressions, i.e. never seen by a human, clicked on by a robot, tells the advertiser you've had a certain amount of viewing or a click-through rate or a view-through that you haven't had. Viewability, another big issue. That's going to affect the way in which we trade in the future. Are we trading on 100% viewability? Well, if you want to stick all the ads at the top of the page, it's about the only way that you can do it. But we all know there's a great value for the people who scroll down a page, find the ad that's not immediately visible, but they're engaging with the content, and actually their engagement with the ad is a lot higher. And then privacy, the death of the cookie on mobile devices, the fact that 65% of people delete cookies, the move towards PPID, how's that going to affect things? So I just want to say there are a few challenges to get to some of those numbers that we've seen, which aren't going to go away. But I hope you found that interesting. If anyone's got any questions, please fire away. Sorry, have we got a microphone? Just that.
I just wondered if the full report was available online.
The full report that these charts are drawn from wouldn't be available, because it's actually a number of different reports and they're for members only. But this presentation is, so you can access that. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.